I want to give a real quick, brief explanation of a few attributes of God. These are supposed to be core, sort of essential attributes of the God of theism. That is the God of traditional theism, the God of the Abrahamic faiths at the very least. That is Islam, Christianity, Judaism. So here are, I think, the three main attributes of God that we're going to be looking for. These are the sort of fancy Latin names for these things. So you can memorize these if you want to be fancy. Omniscience is the property of being all-knowing, of knowing all that there is to be known. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in a second. Omnipotence, or to be omnipotent, is to be all-powerful. Again, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in just a second. And to be omnibenevolent, or to be is just to be perfectly good, morally speaking, but also maybe aesthetically speaking, all the non-moral senses of being good. So God is also perfectly beautiful. Now, those three attributes are taken to be essential to the God of theism. And again, like I said, at the very least, to the God of the Abrahamic faiths. So if you were to give an argument, this is to flesh out the earlier point, if you were to give an argument for the existence of a being, but it didn't show, excuse me, it didn't show that a being existed that was all-knowing or all-powerful or all good, then you wouldn't have given an argument for God's existence. And this will be really relevant as we move forward with this section, because as we'll see, the arguments that we're going to be considering are not fully arguments for God in this respect. They could, you could grant the conclusions of these arguments and deny the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent creature or being. Now, that's not to say that these arguments are good for nothing, right? If I wanted to argue that we ought to go to war with a foreign country in a particular case, it might be one of the steps towards that argument to argue that war is sometimes justified. And you might, in some respect, justly criticize me for saying, well, look, you started out trying to argue that we ought to go to war with, say, Iran. But you didn't show that. All you showed was that war is sometimes justified. And I might say, again, justly in response, that's true, I grant that. But this is one of the steps on the way to arguing that we ought to go to war with Iran. And so similarly, the ultimate goal in arguments for God's existence are to show that God exists, obviously, and that being a being of that is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Now, some of these arguments are just going to show that an intelligent designer had to exist. And they are justly criticized for not having shown on that basis that God exists, because one can be an intelligent designer and even a really, really powerful and really, really smart and really, really good intelligent designer without being all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good. But these are the three core attributes that it's sort of like your wish list. If you could have a perfect argument for God's existence, it would show that a being with these three attributes existed. Now, the authors of the text include two other attributes: that God created the universe from nothing, and that God deserves our unqualified love and complete obedience. I'm not sure why they think these are so important. For one thing, there are many theistic traditions that do not hold that God created the universe from nothing. So maybe you might make the case, or they might have made the case that, well, look, these are things that are kind of core, kind of common to all theistic views. But that's just not true. I mean, for one thing, in the Jewish and Christian scriptures in the book of Genesis, there's a big scholarly debate about whether in Genesis 1, and actually Genesis 1:1, the very first book of the very first verse of the entire Bible, and again a holy book for Jews and Christians, there's a huge scholarly debate still going on about whether it entails or that God created from nothing. Right? Some are actually arguing that it actually has more in common with other ancient Near Eastern myths like Babylonian mythology, that God is not creating from nothing in the Jewish story, that he's actually creating order from pre-existent disorder, which is common to lots of mythologies. Anyway, so it's weird to me that they would require this as a condition or as a kind of core attribute of God that he created from nothing. Yeah, there are lots of Christians, and I think most Christians would say today, not only especially if they're informed about that scholarly debate about Genesis, but even many would say this is not really a core tenet of Christianity. You could be a Christian and not believe that God created the universe from nothing. So that's a weird one for me, and it does seem more essential to the God of theism that he does deserve our unqualified love and complete obedience. But again, I'm not sure why that's relevant. Right? It seems like you will have done a big job if you can show by argument that there's an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about those three qualities. Those are the ones I'm going to focus on. Again, I don't think this is going to come back in the arguments to come, and that is in the arguments for God's existence. It may come up next week in talking about the problem of evil. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit. Omniscient does not mean... Omniscient means that you know all there is to know. So you can't know things that are false. So that doesn't mean that God knows false things. And some have argued that you could be omniscient and not know what free creatures are going to do in the future because there's no fact of the matter yet. There's no fact of the matter about what I'm going to do tomorrow because I'm genuinely free. So it hasn't been decided yet. So maybe many argue, this is a little bit less of a mainstream position, but many theists argue that God knows everything, but he doesn't know what you're going to do tomorrow. And those two claims are compatible if there is no fact of the matter yet about what you're going to do tomorrow. So God could be omniscient and not know what you're going to do tomorrow. Possibly, some argue. Omnipotence, again, does not require that God could just do anything that you describe in words. What it entails is that God can do anything that is logically possible, right? So God cannot you could say simultaneously and not have any contradiction that God cannot make a square circle, but God is still all powerful, right? He can't do logically impossible things, and making a square circle is logically impossible. There's also another paradox that people like to get really clever with about omnipotence. They say, could God make a stone so heavy that he couldn't lift it? And they like to think that they've kind of argued the theist into a corner here by saying, well, look, if the answer is yes, then there's something he can't do. He can't lift that stone. And if the answer is no, then there's something he can't do. He can't make a stone so heavy he can't lift it. And so either way, there's something he can't do. And so omnipotence is kind of incoherent. Well, again, this is a faulty view of what omnipotence requires, right? It doesn't require that you can just do anything whatsoever. It just requires that you can do anything that's logically possible. And so no, God can't create a stone so big that he can't lift it precisely because he's all powerful, right? Just answering no to can God do X does not make God not all powerful. And finally, there's no real puzzles about omnibenevolence. He's perfectly good. Okay. Now, as we'll see next week, this is just a teaser. It's these three attributes that are going to cause a big problem when combined with the existence of evil in the world. Because many will argue that an omniscient being would know about evil, an omnipotent being would be able to eliminate evil, and an omnibenevolent being would want to eliminate evil. And all those three things together, if a being was omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, would eliminate evil, and yet we see evil. So the conclusion there is that such a God or such a being cannot exist. Okay, so that is your little quick intro to the core attributes of God that we're going to be dealing with.